picture this. It is September 1985.
Okay.
You are standing on a quiet, totally ordinary street of terraced council houses.
Right.
This is in a place called Swallow Nest, which is this small, unassuming village in Rotherham, South Yorkshire, England. And you're looking at a family home that has just been completely gutted by a ferocious, aggressive house fire.
And we are talking about total catastrophic devastation here.
Yeah.
The kind of thermal event where, the heat doesn't just burn household items, it essentially vaporizes them.
Wow.
The structural integrity of the room is totally compromised. The floorboards are charred completely through, and the ambient temperature during the blaze would have reached well over 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit.
You step through the charred, splintered remains of the front door.
Yeah.
The air inside is thick, it's acrid, and it catches in the back of your throat. It smells like this toxic mixture of wet ash, melted synthetic carpet, and scorched timber.
Just that horrible, heavy post-fire smell.
Exactly. The living room furniture is completely gone. It's just reduced to these blackened, unrecognizable, smoldering lumps.
Right.
The heavy drapes are nothing but flakes of ash dancing in the draft. Decades of family heirlooms, photo albums, everyday life just completely vanished in a matter of minutes.
It's gone.
But then you look up at the living room wall. The wallpaper has been incinerated. The plaster beneath is practically stripped away, cracked and blistered from the sheer, unimaginable intensity of the heat.
Which is expected, yeah.
Right, but hanging there on that blackened, ruined wall is a single pristine item.
It is the one anomaly in a room defined by absolute destruction.
Yeah.
There is not a single scorch mark on it, no blistering, no heat damage, no soot, even staining the image itself.
It's a cheap, mass-produced, framed print of a toddler.
Yep.
The child in the painting has these massive, sorrowful, almost unnerving eyes staring right at you with giant, glistening tears streaming down his cheeks.
It's quite a haunting image, even without the fire.
It really is.
Mm-hmm.
And the string that was holding the frame to the wall is probably completely burned away, or maybe the painting fell face down onto the scorched floorboards, but the print itself is completely, impossibly untouched.
Unbelievable.
It is literally the only surviving thing in the entire room.
And it's a visual that just completely defies foundational logic.
Right.
When you understand the physics of a confined house fire, you know that a piece of compressed cardboard and paper, which is what this is, should be the very first thing to go up in smoke.
Exactly.
And yet this specific image survived. It is an image that would go on to terrify an entire nation.
Welcome to today's deep dive. Today we are unpacking one of the most pervasive, bizarre, and genuinely terrifying urban legends of the late 20th century. We are looking at the Curse of the Crying Boy.
A classic.
Truly. For those of you joining us, whether you're prepping for a long commute, getting ready for a meeting, or you're just incredibly curious about how modern folklore is constructed, you are in the perfect place.
We have a lot of ground to cover.
We really do. We have a massive stack of sources today. We're pulling from the sensationalist archives of 1980s British tabloids.
Which are wild, by the way.
Oh, completely unhinged. We're also looking at contemporary folklore research from experts like Dr. David Clark, hard scientific fire testing data from structural engineers, and we're even going to take a few comparative tangents into modern myth-making.
Like looking at things like the Montauk Project and other allegedly haunted artworks to see how this all connects.
Exactly. It really is a phenomenal cross-section of data.
It is. I mean, we are looking at art history, post-war psychology, mass media manipulation, and literal material science, all colliding in one very strange, highly publicized story.
So the mission for this deep dive is to answer one fundamental question. How does a cheap, kitschy piece of 1950s living room decor evolve into a nationwide panic?
A massive panic.
Right. A panic so severe, so deeply ingrained in the public consciousness that it required a ritualistic mass bonfire organized by a national newspaper to cure it.
Which is still hard to believe actually happened.
It sounds like fiction. But we are going to blend the chilling folklore of this story with the cold, hard science to find out exactly what happened.
Let's do it.
So before there was a curse, before there were fires or tabloids, there was just an artist working in the shadows of a broken continent.
Right, because to understand the phenomenon, we really have to understand the origin of the image itself.
Which takes us where?
Which takes us back to post-World War II, Europe. Specifically, Venice, Italy.
Okay.
The artist behind these paintings was a man named Bruno Amadio. He was born in 1911, and he was a formally, academically trained Italian painter.
So he wasn't just some hack.
No, not at all. He had the technical skill of a classical artist, but he rarely, if ever, painted these specific portraits under his own name.
Really?
Yeah, he utilized several pseudonyms throughout his career, the most famous one being Giovanni Bruggelin.
Okay.
And occasionally he went by Francois Sibyl.
Which, I have to say, immediately raises a red flag for me. Well, if you are a classically trained artist producing work you are actually proud of, why hide behind a fake name? It feels like he was, I don't know, deliberately trying to distance his real identity from these specific paintings.
I get why you'd think that, but it was actually an incredibly common practice for academically trained artists of that era who simply needed to survive financially.
Oh, because the market was bad.
The European art market was totally decimated after the war. Amadeo needed to make a living, so he had to separate his quote-unquote serious fine art, the work he wanted to be remembered for, from his commercial work.
Ah, so this was just a job for him.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The Crying Boy paintings were essentially commercial cash grabs. He was churning out these highly emotive, easily reproducible paintings, specifically to sell to the influx of tourists visiting Venice in the years following the Second World War.
That makes a lot of sense. And the sources indicate he didn't just paint one or two of these.
No. He produced up to 65 different variations of the Crying Boy and Crying Girl theme.
Wow, 65.
Yeah. And they all share a very specific aesthetic. They depict young, impoverished-looking children, usually dressed in rags or, oversized, tattered clothing.
And the kids are always staring directly out of the front.
Breaking the fourth wall to make direct eye contact with the viewer.
And of course, they have these massive, exaggerated tears streaming down their cheeks. They just look profoundly, overwhelmingly sad.
The subject matter is crucial here. We have to ask why he chose to paint this specific imagery over and over again.
Right?
Europe had just been subjected to the most devastating conflict in human history. Cities were flattened.
Yeah.
And there were thousands of children who had been orphaned wandering the streets of Italy and the rest of Europe. Their lives were completely upended, and they were living in extreme poverty.
So he was painting what he saw.
Amadeo's paintings were initially conceived as a way to capture the very real, very visible plight of these orphan children. It was a direct reflection of the immediate trauma of the post-war era.
I understand painting that as a historical record, or as a piece of social commentary to hang in a gallery to make people think.
Sure.
But the trajectory of these paintings doesn't stay in galleries. They end up mass-produced for home decor.
They do.
And I just struggle to wrap my head around why thousands of ordinary people would voluntarily purchase a deeply depressing painting of a traumatized, weeping orphan and choose to hang it directly above their fireplace.
It seems counterintuitive.
It seems incredibly morbid. I can't imagine saying to my family, hey, let's go buy a picture of a miserable crying child to decorate the living room.
Well, that is the modern sensibility speaking.
Is it?
Yeah. To a contemporary audience, looking back, it feels like pure kitsch. Or worse, emotionally manipulative misery porn.
Exactly.
But we cannot apply 21st century interior design logic to mid-20th century working class Britain. We have to look at the collective psychology of the demographic that was actually buying these prints.
Okay, let's dig into that.
These reproductions hit the UK mass market hard in the 1960s and 1970s. They were sold incredibly cheaply in department stores, most notably Woolworths.
Right, the classic high street store.
And the primary consumers were the working class, heavily concentrated in northern England.
So we are talking about places like Yorkshire, Nottingham, Manchester, heavy industrial heartlands.
Yes.
These were communities that had suffered immensely during the war.
Immensely. This demographic had endured a level of collective trauma that is hard to overstate. They lived through the terror of the Blitz, where their cities were bombed nightly.
Right.
They endured strict, grueling rationing that lasted for years, even after the war had officially ended. Almost every family had lost husbands, sons, brothers, or neighbors.
It was just a generation saturated in loss.
Exactly. They were carrying a phenomenal, heavy burden of unspoken grief. And in that specific cultural context, the painting did not feel morbid or depressing to them.
No.
It felt authentic, it felt honest.
Wow. So it wasn't about wanting to look at something sad to bring the mood down. It was more like finding a visual representation of the internal state they were already in.
Precisely. British society at the time was famously governed by the stiff upper lip mentality.
You don't complain.
Right, you were expected to just carry on, go to work, rebuild, and never complain. There was no widespread therapy, no open dialogue about PTSD or trauma.
I'm hanging this painting.
Hanging this painting in the home was a way of silently, almost subconsciously, acknowledging the sorrow they all carried but culturally could not articulate.
That's fascinating.
It mirrored a sadness that was universal in those communities. To them, the children in the paintings weren't creepy. They were beautiful, resilient, and poignant.
That reframes the entire phenomenon for me. It really wasn't an aesthetic choice. It was almost like an emotional utility. They felt seen by the artwork.
Yes.
And because the prints were so incredibly cheap to mass produce, they became ubiquitous. The sources estimate that over 50,000 copies were bought in Britain alone during this period.
50,000. It's a huge number.
They became an absolute staple of the working class home. You would walk into a terraced house in Sheffield, and there would be a floral sofa, a television set, and a crying boy on the wall.
They saturated the market, and then they just blended into the background.
Right.
For over a decade, tens of thousands of people hung these prints on a Tuesday afternoon, dusted them occasionally, and completely forgot about them. They were innocuous wallpaper. They were entirely stripped of any menace or superstition.
They were just cardboard and ink.
Exactly.
Until a seemingly normal Tuesday in September of 1985 changed everything.
The catalyst.
Yes. Which brings us back to our opening scene. Let's look closely at the inciting incident.
Okay.
We are in Swallownest, Rotherham, South Yorkshire. We have Ron and May Hall. They are a completely ordinary couple who have lived in their terrace council home for 27 years.
Just a normal family.
They know their neighbors. They have a quiet life. Their 25-year-old son, David, is in the kitchen cooking. He leaves a chip pan unattended on the stove. It overheats, and it ignites.
And a chip pan fire is a particularly brutal kind of domestic disaster.
Can you explain that a bit? I feel like people today might not realize how dangerous they were.
Yeah, for context, before the widespread use of thermostatically controlled deep fat fryers, people used simple metal pans filled with cooking fat or oil.
Literally just a pot of boiling grease on an open flame.
Exactly. It was an incredibly common yet highly dangerous method of cooking in the UK. If the oil overheats, it reaches its auto-ignition temperature and bursts into flames without even needing a spark.
Wow.
And the terrifying part is the human reaction. If someone panics and throws water on a grease fire...
Which is the first instinct for most people.
Right, but the water instantly vaporizes into steam, expanding violently and aerosolizing the burning oil. It creates a literal fireball that fills the room in seconds.
But it's terrifying.
The fire spreads with a speed and ferocity that gives occupants barely any time to escape.
And that's exactly what happened here. The ground floor of the Hall residence was completely annihilated by this fire.
Yeah.
But, as we established in the introduction, when the smoke cleared, their cheap print of the crying boy was found entirely untouched by the inferno.
Sitting right there in the rubble.
Now, if that was the end of the story, you chalk it up to a weird one-off coincidence, right? The painting fell weirdly, the fire missed that patch of wall, whatever.
Sure.
But here is where the story shifts from a local tragedy to a localized superstition. The sources introduce us to Peter Hall.
Right, Peter Hall. He is Ron's brother. And crucially, Peter happens to be a serving local firefighter in Rotherham.
And Peter didn't just show up to his brother's burned-down house, see the painting and say, oh wow, what a bizarre coincidence.
No, he didn't.
The archives reveal a highly specific, very chilling detail. Peter had explicitly warned his brother before the fire ever happened to get rid of the crying boy painting.
He had. And he hadn't warned him because he just didn't like the artwork.
Right.
Peter and his colleagues at the local fire station had already begun to notice a highly disturbing pattern in their line of work.
This part is so wild to me.
They had actually formed a private, unspoken pact among themselves at the station to never, under any circumstances, allow a crying boy painting to be brought into their own homes.
That detail is staggering. I mean, think about the psychology of a firefighter.
Oh, absolutely.
These are deeply practical, brave, no-nonsense professionals. Their entire job revolves around understanding the brutal, unforgiving physics of fire. They know about combustion, thermodynamics, flashpoints. They see destruction every single day.
They are not prone to magical thinking.
Exactly. And yet, this entire station of hardened professionals has a secret pact because they are fundamentally terrified of a piece of mass-produced cardboard.
Well, they had empirical data, or at least a highly compelling accumulation of anecdotal data to back up their fear.
What kind of data?
During this period, another figure emerged in the reporting. Station officer Alan Wilkinson.
Okay.
Wilkinson was a seasoned fire chief, and he had personally kept a log dating all the way back to 1973.
A 12-year log.
Yep. And in that log, he had documented over 50 separate, distinct house fires where a crying boy painting had survived completely intact amidst the total destruction of the surrounding room.
Over 50 fires.
Over 50.
50 separate incidents where everything else burns to ash, but the crying orphan makes it out without a scorch mark.
It's a lot.
The tension between the rational scientific worldview and the creeping irrational dread here is just palpable.
It is. But Wilkinson himself was a consummate professional. When interviewed, he explicitly and repeatedly stated that he did not believe in ghosts, curses, or the supernatural.
So what did he blame the fires on?
Human error. He looked at every single one of those 50 fires and correctly blamed them on mundane human carelessness.
Like the chip pans.
Exactly. He pointed to discarded cigarettes left burning on sofas, faulty and outdated electrical wiring in older council homes, and, of course, unattended chip pans.
So Wilkinson looked at the ignition sources and saw clear, undeniable, mundane causality. The fires were starting for perfectly normal, albeit tragic, reasons.
Right, but it was the survival of the painting that he simply could not explain with his current understanding of fire dynamics.
You couldn't figure out why this specific brand of high-density board wasn't burning.
No, he couldn't. And the juxtaposition is fascinating. You have the ultimate rational observer, the fire chief, insisting it's human error. But the visual of the surviving painting was so powerful that even his own wife was quoted in the press speculating that the boy's tears put the fire out.
The boy's tears put the fire out. That is such a poetic, haunting, and deeply melancholic image.
It really is.
The literal tears of the painted child, extinguishing the flames immediately surrounding it. It perfectly encapsulates how desperately people wanted an explanation for something that felt physically impossible.
Because when science seemingly fails to provide an immediate answer, we immediately default to myth.
Right, it highlights a core human vulnerability, doesn't it? The desire to assign agency and narrative to the inexplicable.
Definitely. A local oddity, a whispered superstition among a small group of firefighters in Yorkshire, is a fascinating sociological micro-study on its own.
Sure.
But a local oddity stays local unless it finds a megaphone loud enough to broadcast it to the masses.
And unfortunately for the peace of mind of the British public, it found the loudest megaphone possible. This brings us to the media landscape of the 1980s and the arrival of a man named Kelvin Mackenzie.
To understand how this local oddity became a national panic, you really have to understand the environment of Fleet Street in the 1980s.
Fleet Street being the traditional home of the British press.
Yes. Kelvin Mackenzie was the highly controversial, notoriously aggressive editor of the UK tabloid The Sun.
Right.
At this time, The Sun was locked in a bitter, daily, cutthroat battle for readership against its main rival, the Daily Mirror. The circulation wars were ruthless.
It wasn't about nuanced journalism.
Oh, not at all.
It was entirely about the splash.
The splash, exactly.
The splash is that sensational, eye-catching, massive front-page story that forces a commuter to grab your paper off the newsstand instead of the competitors. And Mackenzie was a master of the splash.
He was a genius at it.
He sees this obscure local story filtering out of a South Yorkshire news agency, the devastated home, the miraculously surviving painting, the fact that the firefighter brother had warned him, the log of 50 previous fires.
All the perfect ingredients.
Right. And Mackenzie looks at all these elements and declares, this one's got legs.
Which, in tabloid parlance, having legs means it's a story that won't just be a one-day wonder.
It'll keep going.
Yeah, it's a narrative that will run and run, generating follow-ups, reader letters, and escalating drama for weeks. Mackenzie recognized that this story possessed all the vital elements of perfect tabloid fodder.
It had the tragedy.
It had devastating human tragedy, an unsolved mystery, extreme relatability for their working-class readership, since so many of them actually owned the painting, and just enough of a touch of the occult to make it thrilling.
So, on September 4th, 1985, The Sun published a headline that essentially broke the psychology of Britain.
It was massive.
In massive, bold block letters across the front page, it read, "Blazing Curse of the Crying Boy." And right underneath the picture of the painting, the caption read, "Tears for Fears."
It was a brilliant, if entirely unscrupulous piece of editorial framing.
Because of the word curse.
Notice the use of the word curse, yes. By putting that word in a national, highly circulated publication, they didn't just report objectively on a weird statistical phenomenon, they validated the superstition.
They made it real.
They gave millions of people official permission to be afraid. They codified the anxiety.
And the floodgates completely spectacularly opened. The sources describe an absolute avalanche of reader responses pouring into the newspaper's offices.
It's bags and bags of mail.
Honestly, looking at how this played out, the best analogy I can think of isn't from the 1980s at all. It's perfectly analogous to a modern viral internet challenge or a piece of crowdsourced digital creepypasta like Slender Man.
That is a very astute comparison.
You have an algorithm, or in this analog era, the national newspaper, that feeds purely on public engagement. The paper prints a scary story, which generates fear. That fear prompts readers to scour their own lives for connections and write in with their own story.
And then the paper prints those news stories, which generates even more fear.
Exactly. It's a closed-loop amplification cycle of pure paranoia.
The newspaper was essentially acting as an analog social media platform. They were aggregating, curating, and broadcasting the anxieties of its readership to create a self-sustaining narrative.
And the anecdotes that people sent in, which The Sun eagerly published, were a wild mix of genuinely terrifying coincidences and utterly absurd leaps of logic.
Let's dig into some of those anecdotes because they really show how quickly the definition of the curse expanded.
Yeah, first we have Dora Mann from Surrey. She wrote in claiming that her house was completely gutted by fire just 6 months after she purchased the Crying Boy painting. But she explicitly noted in her letter that she had an extensive collection of other paintings in her house, and every single one of them was destroyed by the flames, except the Crying Boy, which survived perfectly.
Which just feeds right into the established narrative.
Exactly. Then there was a commercial property, a pizza parlor in Great Yarmouth.
Right, I remember this one.
The owner reported that the establishment burned to the ground. The tables, the chairs, the heavy industrial kitchen equipment, all of it was reduced to ash and warped metal. But the cheap print of the boy hanging on the wall, untouched.
And the panic started to generate physical manifestations of fear. People were seeing things.
Like the swinging painting.
Yes, a woman named Sandra Caskey, living in Kilburn, reported that before her house caught fire, she physically saw the painting swinging from side to side on the wall, completely on its own, like a pendulum.
Which is straight out of a horror movie.
It is. She also claimed that her sister-in-law and a friend both suffered severe house fire shortly after buying their own copies of the print. So the curse was seemingly contagious now.
And then, the logic of the curse starts to completely break down into the absurd.
It always does.
There's a reader from a town called Panyonton. She wrote an earnest letter to The Sun, claiming that her 11-year-old son had somehow managed to catch his private parts on the picture hook while attempting to hang the painting on the wall.
Which is anatomically baffling, to say the least.
Right. Like, how does that even happen?
I have no idea. But structurally, it is incredibly revealing. It shows exactly how the panic was mutating.
It wasn't just about fire anymore.
No, the curse was no longer strictly confined to fire survival. The Crying Boy had become a supernatural magnet for absolutely any stroke of bad luck.
Ah, I see.
If you bought the painting and a week later someone in your family got sick, or you lost your job, or your car broke down, or your son had a bizarre, inexplicable accident with a picture hook.
It wasn't just bad luck anymore.
Exactly. It was the Crying Boy's fault. The painting became the ultimate scapegoat for the chaos of everyday life.
The cult of the curse was expanding its borders. And it wasn't just Bruno Amadio's specific Crying Boy anymore.
No, the parameters widened.
People started believing that any mass-produced painting of a crying child was inherently dangerous. The sources note that a well-respected Scottish painter named Anna Zinkhysen had produced a series of artworks called Childhood, which also featured crying children.
Totally different artist, totally different style.
Right. But suddenly her paintings, entirely unrelated to Amadio's, were turning up at the scenes of fires and being loudly blamed by terrified homeowners. The visual motif of a crying child itself had become weaponized.
The national panic really reached a fever pitch by late autumn of 1985. People were trapped in a paradox of fear.
What do you mean?
Well, they were absolutely terrified to keep these prints in their homes, convinced they were harboring a demonic fire starter. But conversely, they were deeply superstitious and terrified to throw them away, fearing that discarding the cursed object would anger the spirit and trigger the fire anyway.
Oh man, so they felt totally trapped.
Exactly. Some readers reported taking matters into their own hands, trying to burn the paintings themselves in their garden incinerators to break the curse.
Did it work?
No. They would douse them in lighter fluid, strike a match, and then report back in horror that the paintings were miraculously fireproof. A security guard named Paul Collier was quoted claiming he threw one onto a raging bonfire, left it there for a full hour, and came back to find the painting sitting in the embers entirely unscorched.
So imagine the state of the public. They are absolutely terrified. They feel trapped in their own living rooms with these seemingly indestructible demonic prints staring back at them.
It's a genuine psychological crisis.
The media has successfully manufactured a monster and let it loose in the minds of the working class. But from a purely cynical tabloid management perspective, if you want to keep selling papers, you can't just leave your readers paralyzed with fear.
Right, you have to offer a resolution.
You have to offer them a savior. Which brings us to the climax of the hysteria. The Halloween exorcism of 1985.
This is one of the most surreal events in British media history.
Kelvin Mackenzie, the editor of The Sun, surveys the panic he has created and pulls off what might be the most contradictory, cynical, and brilliant tabloid masterstroke of the entire decade.
He really did.
He publishes a massive call to action to the British public. He basically says, send us your cursed unburnable paintings and we will burn them for you.
The sheer irony of this directive is rich.
It makes no sense.
Think about the internal logic here. The entire premise of the curse sin, the core, terrifying fact that had gripped the nation and fueled the headlines for 2 straight months, was that these specific paintings could not be burned.
They survived house fires, they survived garden incinerators.
Yet the grand solution proposed by the newspaper to rid the nation of the curse was to throw them into a giant fire.
The logistics of this generated panic are staggering to visualize. People didn't just send in a few dozen. They mailed them in by the sackful.
The postal service was overwhelmed.
The Royal Mail was delivering packages marked urgent, danger, and cursed in massive quantities. The sources describe the scene inside the Sun's London offices on Bouverie Street. They received approximately 2,500 crying boy paintings.
2,500.
They had to stack them up in the corridors. The piles were 12 feet high, literally blocking the hallways.
Yeah.
Journalists and editors were physically tripping over mountains of crying orphans just to get to their desks.
They had essentially crowdsourced a mountain of perceived cursed artifacts. They had turned a psychological phenomenon into a massive physical logistical problem within their own headquarters.
And then the ritual itself. Paint the scene in your mind. It is Halloween night, October 31st, 1985.
Of course it was Halloween.
Right, a dark, crisp, atmospheric autumn night. The newspaper hires trucks to transport this mountain of 2,500 paintings out of London to a designated site near Reading, right by the River Thames. They use construction equipment to build a massive, towering bonfire. They invite the local fire brigade to stand by. They bring out their reporters, their photographers to document the climax of the story. And because this is the Sun tabloid in the mid-1980s, they bring along their page 3 glamour models to officiate.
Yes, this is a uniquely bizarre detail.
It's so weird.
Women like Sandra Jane Moore, whose primary role at the newspaper was to pose topless on page 3, were brought out into the autumn chill to ritually toss the paintings into the flames.
Unbelievable.
It added a surreal, almost carnival-like atmosphere to what was supposed to be a banishing of evil. Moore even admitted to reporters that she had defaced one of the prints before throwing it in, drawing spiky red devil hair on the crying boy with a marker.
It is the most absurd, perfectly distilled, uniquely British 1980s tableau you can possibly imagine.
Yeah.
Scantily clad glamour models throwing cursed kitsch art into a giant Halloween bonfire while bemused firefighters stand by with hoses.
It's quite the mental image.
But here is the major logical hurdle for me. I really need your perspective on this. They are out there, literally burning the unburnable paintings.
Yeah.
In real time, on camera, they are proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that the curse is fundamentally false.
Yes, they are.
They're demonstrating that the cardboard does, in fact, catch fire and burn to ash if you put it in a big enough fire with enough accelerant.
Yeah.
So why did this work psychologically? Why didn't the public look at the photos in the burning paintings and say, oh, I guess they weren't unburnable magic after all, we've been stupid?
That is the crucial question, and the answer cuts to the very heart of human psychology and the function of folklore. It worked precisely because it was a physical ritual.
A ritual.
Yes. As a species, humans have an innate, deeply ingrained need to perform physical rituals to banish psychological fears. We have done this for millennia across every culture on Earth.
Like what?
Think of religious exorcisms, or the burning of effigies, or throwing salt over your shoulder to ward off bad luck, or lighting a candle for the dead. When a fear becomes overwhelming, omnipresent, and intangible, like an invisible curse haunting your home, you cannot reason it away with logic. You cannot hand a terrified homeowner a scientific white paper on the ignition temperatures of fire-retardant varnishes and expect their deep-seated visceral terror to vanish. Rationality does not cure irrational dread.
I see. So you have to meet the irrational theatrical fear with an equally irrational, highly visible theatrical performance.
Exactly. The Halloween bonfire was not a scientific demonstration of flammability. It was an act of national public catharsis. It was theater.
It was a performance.
Even though the literal act of the paintings burning proved the premise of the curse factually wrong, the performance of the destruction gave the nation the psychological permission it needed to let go of the fear. The fire officer at the scene, who watched the whole absurd spectacle, was quoted saying, "I think there will be many people who can breathe a little easier now." And he was right. The ritual provided closure. The monster had been publicly slain by the very entity that created it.
And the fires died down, the embers cooled, the piles of ash blew away over the River Thames. The 1980s moved on, the tabloids found new scandals, and the hysteria slowly faded from the front pages.
It became yesterday's news.
The crying boy became a punchline, a memory of a weirder time. But legends don't really die, do they?
No, they just go dormant.
They sink into the cultural groundwater, waiting for new technology to resurrect them.
Which takes us out of the 1980s and into the era where myths mutate at light speed. The internet age and the anatomy of a modern myth.
We jump forward a decade and a half to the late 1990s and the early 2000s. The internet arrives, message boards pop up, and it fundamentally changes the way folklore spreads and evolves.
It's a game changer for urban legends.
The tabloid runs a story for a few weeks, burns a pile of cardboard, and then moved on to the next scandal. But the internet remembers everything.
It does.
And more importantly, the internet demands backstory. The legend of the crying boy mutated online. It was no longer enough that the paintings just magically survived fires. For an internet audience used to complex narratives, they needed to know why. The myths required a villain origin story.
As the saying goes, nature abhors a vacuum, and so does an urban legend. If there's a curse, there must be a motive.
Right.
The most prominent, elaborate, and widely shared origin story for the crying boy was pushed by an author named Tom Sleeman, who included it in his 2000 book, Haunted Liverpool.
Okay, we need to walk through this narrative because it reads exactly like a pitch for a gothic horror movie.
It really does.
According to Sleeman's widely circulated account, the artist, Bruno Amadio, was wandering the streets of Madrid in 1969. He finds a little, impoverished, mute orphan boy wandering alone. A local Catholic priest rushes over to the artist and frantically warns him, "Do not go near that child."
A classic trope.
Oh, totally. The priest claims the boy is named Don Benillo, but the terrified locals simply refer to him as El Diablo.
The devil child.
Right. And the reason he is called El Diablo, the story goes, is because the boy had watched his parents die in a horrific house fire. And ever since that traumatic day, mysterious deadly fires broke out wherever the boy went.
He's a fire starter.
Exactly. But the artist, in a fit of arrogant inspiration, ignores the priest's warnings, adopts the boy, and paints his portrait. The boy's sorrowful tears are captured on canvas. But then, tragically and inevitably, the artist's studio mysteriously burns to the ground, destroying his life's work.
Of course it does.
Ruined and furious, the artist blames the boy and kicks him out onto the street. The boy runs away crying. Fast forward several years to 1976, a car veers violently off the road on the outskirts of Barcelona, crashes into a concrete wall, and explodes into a massive fireball.
Another fire.
The driver is burned entirely beyond recognition. But inside the glove box of the burned-out wreckage, which somehow miraculously survived the inferno, investigators find an untouched driver's license. The name on the pristine license, Don Benillo. He was 19 years old.
It is a perfectly constructed, tightly woven cinematic tragedy.
It's a great story.
It is. You have the cursed fire starter ultimately consumed by the very element he commanded, leaving his tormented memory to curse the artwork forever. It provides a highly satisfying narrative arc. But here is where we must apply the rigors of forensic debunking. We cannot just accept a good story. Folklorist Dr. David Clark of Sheffield Hallam University has meticulously investigated this specific narrative, tracking down the claims and the timelines.
And when he actually looked at the historical record, what did he find?
Complete, utter fabrication from top to bottom.
None of it was true.
None of it. First, let's look at the timeline, which is mathematically impossible. Slemon's book claims that the source of this story was a retired schoolmaster named George Mallory, who supposedly tracked down and interviewed the artist Bruno Amadio in 1995 to get this dark confession.
Okay.
The problem, Bruno Amadio died in 1981.
Oh, it is incredibly hard to give an in-depth interview about your cursed orphan 14 years after you've been buried.
Precisely. The core source of the story is demonstrably false. Furthermore, Dr. Clark checked Spanish records. There is absolutely no record of a Don Bonillo existing, nor is there any police or fire record of a fiery car crash matching that description in Barcelona in 1976.
So the kid didn't exist and the crash didn't happen.
Right. Dr. Clark also points out that the real Amadio did not live a tragic, ruined life as a cursed artist whose studio burned down. He actually lived a relatively prosperous, quiet, and stable life in Padua, Italy, eventually passing away from natural causes.
So, if the Don Bonillo story is completely fake, if the dates don't match, the people don't exist, and the crashes never happened, why did it become the accepted, undeniable truth on early internet forums and paranormal blogs?
This brings us to a concept called mythopoeia, the conscious or unconscious making of a myth. As we discussed, a haunted object is infinitely scarier and much more viral if it has a clear motive.
Yeah, you want a villain.
The Don Bonillo story is a brilliant mashup of existing tabloid elements, inherent human tragedy, and classic literary horror tropes. It provides the legend with a coherent internal logic. It gives the fire a reason to burn.
It connects the dots.
Exactly. Without Don Bonillo, the crying boy is just a weird anomaly of physics. With Don Bonillo, it is a story of vengeance and tragedy that you want to share with your friends.
If we zoom out and look at the broader context of comparative folklore, we see this exact same process of mythopoeia happening constantly. Our sources drew a really fascinating parallel to another massive modern legend, the Montauk Project.
Well, yeah.
Let's dig into that comparison, because it shows how universal this process is.
The Montauk Project is an exceptional parallel. It is a perfect example of how mundane reality, fringe science, real geographical locations, and science fiction tropes blend together to form indestructible internet conspiracies.
For those who aren't deep into conspiracy lore, the Montauk Project is this massive, sprawling theory centered on a place called Camp Hero.
Right.
Camp Hero is an actual physical place, a decommissioned military radar base located on the extreme eastern tip of Long Island, New York. It has a huge, looming, very creepy-looking Sage radar tower that you can still see today.
It looks like something out of a sci-fi movie.
It totally does. And the legend claims that the U.S. government wasn't just watching for Soviet bombers there. They claimed the base was a black site for mind control experiments, interdimensional travel, and time manipulation.
As you do.
Naturally. The core of the story goes that they somehow opened a time portal to 1943, connecting Montauk to the infamous Philadelphia experiment. And supposedly, a psychic test subject named Duncan Cameron stepped through the portal, encountered his younger self, and created a massive time paradox.
And just like the Crying Boy legend, the Montauk Project has its own George Mallory figures. Men like Preston Nichols, who published books claiming they worked at the base but had their memories suppressed by the government for decades.
The suppressed memory angle.
Always. The structural similarities between the two myths are striking. Both legends take a deeply mundane reality, a cheap piece of cardboard art, or a rusted, decommissioned Cold War radar base, and layer it with intricate, highly detailed sci-fi or supernatural narrative.
They build a whole universe around it.
And crucially, both legends rely on untraceable sources and timelines that completely collapse when you check the historical facts. Camp Hero, for example, was fully decommissioned by the military in 1981, which was 2 years before the alleged climactic 1983 Montauk incident involving the time portal was supposed to have happened.
The facts completely debunk this story. Yet the legend thrives. It's so culturally powerful that it heavily inspired the Duffer Brothers when they created the show Stranger Things.
Which is a massive cultural touchstone.
It shows how we as a culture build these massive, complex architectures of myth around everyday objects and places to make the world feel more mysterious.
We want the magic to be real.
The sources also compare the Crying Boy to another famous piece of haunted art, the portrait of Bernardo de Galvez. I found this comparison really useful for understanding how we interact with these curses.
It is a very revealing comparison. The Galvez portrait is an 18th century painting that hangs at the end of a hallway in the Bourbon Orleans Hotel in New Orleans.
Okay.
Guests and staff have claimed for years that the painted eyes of the general follow them down the hall, but the haunting has a very specific, codified rule. Supposedly, any photographs taken of the portrait will come out completely black, out of focus, or ruined, unless the viewer first asks aloud, "May I take your picture, General Galvez?"
A local tourist pamphlet even recounted a highly specific story of a woman who asked the general nicely and got a perfectly clear picture, while her skeptical friend, who refused to ask permission, took a photo at the exact same time and got a completely blacked out Polaroid.
The psychological difference between the two paintings is crucial. The Galvez haunting requires active participation. It is an enacted ritual, a negotiated relationship between the inanimate object and the living witness. You have to ask for consent.
Right.
The crying boy, however, is a completely passive curse. You don't interact with it, you don't talk to it, it just sits there and brings destruction to your home.
But both artworks highlight humanity's profound, desperate desire to interact with the unknown. We want to feel that the inanimate world is alive, that it is watching us, and that it has rules we can figure out.
It is incredibly thrilling to sit around a campfire or a Reddit thread and talk about cursed Spanish orphans, time-traveling psychic chairs in Long Island, and haunted Revolutionary War generals.
We love the myth.
We do.
But at the end of the day, we have to return to the real world. When a house in Rotherham actually burns down, and a painting actually survives, there is physical, molecular matter left behind in the ashes. And that physical matter holds the real, undeniable answers.
Which brings us to the final piece of the puzzle.
Right. The cold, hard science.
Because eventually, the legend had to face the scrutiny of the laboratory. It took decades. But in 2010, the British comedian and broadcaster Steve Punt, working alongside a fire safety researcher named Martin Shipp, decided to finally, definitively test the crying boy painting using forensic scientific methods.
They didn't just guess. They took this to the Building Research Establishment, which is a highly respected facility that specializes in fire safety testing for construction materials.
They did it right.
They managed to get their hands on an original, authentic 1970s print of the crying boy. And in a controlled environment, they literally held a naked flame, burning at hundreds of degrees, 2 feet high, directly to the face of the painting.
The moment of truth.
And what happened? Did it burst into unholy flames?
No. It barely scorched.
Really?
The flame licked the surface of the image, and the painting essentially ignored it.
No Dom Bonillo spirit leaping out of the canvas.
Just basic, undeniable chemistry and physics.
Amazing.
The investigation revealed the precise, mundane mechanics of exactly why these specific paintings survived so many infernos.
Okay, lay it on me.
The first major factor is the materials used in the manufacturing process. These were not traditional oil paintings on canvas. Canvas is woven fabric. It is highly oxygenated and burns like tinder.
Right, it's basically cloth.
But to keep costs low, these mass-produced prints were stamped onto high-density compressed hardboard. Hardboard is incredibly dense. It is made of exploded wood fibers that are highly compacted under immense pressure and heat.
So there's no air in it.
Because it is so dense, there is very little oxygen between the fibers. This makes it incredibly difficult to ignite without prolonged, sustained, extremely high heat focused on a single point.
Okay, that makes sense. If it's painted on a flimsy canvas, that's basically a giant wick for a fire. But if it's on a dense piece of wood, it has a shield. So the back is protected by the thickness of the hardboard.
Yes.
But that doesn't explain the front of the image. The paper and the ink on the front should still go up like a matchstick, right? Were they treating the images with something?
Yes, and the chemistry is the second critical factor. The investigation found that the prints were coated in a specific type of clear varnish.
Varnish.
In the 1960s and 70s, it was common to use varnishes that contained phenolic resins or similar compounds to protect cheap prints from fading in sunlight or warping from moisture.
Okay.
But an unintended side effect of these specific industrial varnishes is that they are highly effective fire retardants.
Wait, really? So the manufacturer wasn't trying to make indestructible art. They just accidentally fireproofed their cheap kitsch to stop it from getting water damage.
Exactly. The varnish acted as a chemical barrier that resisted flame.
That is wild.
But even with hardboard and varnish, the painting would eventually burn if left in a raging fire long enough. The most crucial element, the piece of the puzzle that explains the pristine survival, is the actual physical mechanics of a room on fire.
You mean how the painting behaves when the wall gets hot?
Yeah.
Walk me through the exact sequence of events when a room catches fire.
When a room ignites, say, from a chip pan, the hot gases rise and the fire climbs the walls. The very first thing behind the painting to succumb to the heat is the thin piece of string or wire holding the frame to the picture hook.
Oh, of course.
Long before the thick hardboard can reach its ignition temperature, that string burns through or snaps. The heavy hardboard immediately falls off the wall and drops to the floor.
Okay.
And because of the aerodynamics of a flat, heavy board falling, it almost always lands face down.
Oh, wow. Okay, so think about the physics and geometry of that specific position. The painting is lying completely flat on the floorboards. The incredibly dense, hard-to-burn hardboard backing is facing up, taking the brunt of any falling debris and acting as a shield. The floor itself is protecting the front of the image, and the front of the image is already coated in a fire-retardant chemical varnish, creating a seal against the floorboards.
You've got it.
It essentially creates a physical microenvironment of flame resistance. The house literally burns around the painting, leaving it protected in this tiny, accidental safe zone.
That is exactly what happens. It is a masterpiece of accidental engineering.
So, it wasn't a curse.
Sure.
It wasn't Don Benio. It was just really, really good mid-century industrial manufacturing.
That's the truth.
That's almost disappointing. It ruins the ghost story.
Mm.
But here is my genuine pushback on this. Even if it's fireproof, even if it falls face down, what about the sheer staggering volume of fires?
All right, the numbers.
How do you explain the fact that Peter Hall's fire station in Rotherham went to 50 different houses that burned down, and every single one of those devastated homes had this exact painting? That feels statistically impossible without some kind of connection.
That is the most common sticking point for people trying to debunk the myth, but we have to remember the tragedy of probability. This is where statistical reality clashes with human perception.
How so?
Consider the raw numbers we discussed earlier. Over 50,000 copies of this print were sold in the UK alone. They were wildly popular, specifically in working-class neighborhoods.
The exact same heavily industrialized neighborhoods where people were cooking with highly dangerous chip pans.
Precisely. We have to look at the domestic environment in the 1970s and 1980s. House fires were tragically, overwhelmingly common compared to today.
People smoked indoors a lot more.
People smoked heavily indoors, often in bed. They used highly flammable chip pans daily. Older council houses had outdated electrical wiring. And crucially, modern smoke detectors were not yet universally installed or mandated.
So fires are just happening all the time.
Yes. Statistically speaking, if you have 50,000 highly flammable homes and you put a highly fire-resistant object in every single one of them, the law of large numbers dictates that hundreds of those objects are mathematically bound to be in houses that eventually catch fire.
It's a pure numbers game. If I manufacture a fireproof brick and I put that brick in 50,000 kitchens, and 100 of those kitchens inevitably burn down because of cooking accidents, the firemen are going to find 100 unburned bricks in the ashes.
Exactly.
But you wouldn't look at the brick and say the brick caused the fire, because it's a brick.
Right.
But because the object in this case was a highly emotive, psychologically resonant picture of a crying, traumatized child, our brains couldn't handle the coincidence.
Yeah.
We assigned blame to the face looking back at us.
And this psychological deflection brings up a very serious, real-world consequence that occurred during the panic.
What was that?
Mick Riley, who was the chief fire officer of South Yorkshire during the height of the hysteria, was intensely frustrated by the tabloid narrative. He issued multiple public statements desperately trying to calm the public down.
Because they were panicking over nothing.
Worse than nothing. He pointed out the grave danger of the myth. People were so terrified of a piece of cardboard that they were completely ignoring the actual lethal fire hazards in their own home.
He's literally begging the public through the press, please stop worrying about the ghost boy on your wall, and please, for the love of God, stop leaving your chip pans unattended on the stove. Put a battery in your smoke detector. Stop smoking in bed.
The panic over the curse actively distracted an entire nation from practical, life-saving fire safety. It is a profound psychological truth. It is much easier and far less guilt-inducing to blame an external, supernatural force for a tragedy than it is to change your own hazardous daily habits or accept that senseless accidents happen.
Wow, okay. We have covered a massive amount of ground today, from Venetian orphans to time-traveling radars, to the chemistry of varnish. Let's synthesize all of this as we bring this deep dive to a close.
It's a lot to take in.
The Curse of the Crying Boy isn't really a story about the paranormal at all. It is the ultimate story of how multiple, distinct cultural elements accidentally perfectly collided to create a modern monster.
It is the perfect storm of circumstances. You have mass-produced kitsch art that perfectly accidentally tapped into the vulnerable, unspoken psychology and grief of post-war Britain.
Yeah.
You combine that with the incredibly aggressive, circulation-hungry, entirely ruthless tabloid journalism of the 1980s, which was willing to manufacture and validate panic for profit.
And then the science.
And you underpin all of it with the completely coincidental industrial engineering of fire-retardant varnish and high-density compressed hardboard.
When you put those three things together, psychological vulnerability, media manipulation, and a quirk of physics, you get a legend that successfully terrifies a nation.
You do.
It makes you think deeply about our own homes and how we process tragedy. When disaster strikes, when something utterly devastating like a house fire destroys your life's memories and your safety in a matter of minutes, the human brain cannot handle the randomness.
It's too much.
It desperately seeks a reason, a narrative. It is psychologically easier and, strangely, maybe even a little more comforting to point at a malicious, supernatural force, a cursed painting of an orphan, than it is to accept the terrifying, random unpredictability of life.
A curse gives the tragedy a narrative structure. It gives it meaning. A forgotten chip pan on a Tuesday night is just a senseless, painful accident. We prefer the curse because we can fight a curse.
We can burn a cursed painting.
Exactly. We cannot burn away random chance.
It is profound when you look at it that way. We build the monsters we need to explain the chaos we can't control. And I want to leave you, our listener, with a final provocative thought to mull over as you go about your day. If a simple, mass-produced physical print stamped on cheap hardboard could act as a sponge for the collective anxieties of an entire nation in the 1980s, what are we doing right now?
That is the question.
What mass-produced digital images or algorithmic trends or viral internet videos are we currently charging with our modern fears?
It is a highly compelling question. The medium of delivery changes, from Woolworth's prints to social media feeds, but the fundamental human need to project our complex anxieties onto our media does not change.
What will be the cursed painting of the internet age? Maybe it is already hanging on your digital wall disguised as a meme or a viral conspiracy. Think back to that blackened, ruined living room in Rotherham, the smell of wet ash, the destroyed furniture, and that pristine, crying face staring back through the smoke.
We wanted the boy to be magic.
Because the stark reality of the fire was just too hard to bear. Keep your smoke detectors checked, folks, and watch your chip pans. We'll catch you on the next Deep Dive.